There are moments in every person's life when they face intense adversity. They're crucibles that forge who they become as individuals and as leaders. Now more than ever, we need leaders who are called to a higher standard, focused on leaving it better than they found it, and paying it forward to the next generations. Now, let's join Fire Chief Randy Brugman as he speaks with leaders from all walks of life, as he explores and learns from their personal journeys and the crucibles that have forged them into better leaders and better people.
Welcome back to another episode of the Leadership Crucible. Today it's an honor for me to have on the show Kirk, who is the leader of worldwide public safety and justice for Microsoft, with responsibility over experts that serve the public safety and justice communities all over the world. He has over 18 years of experience as a federal and municipal law enforcement official in the United States. In this role, Kirk is responsible for all aspects of business, including the development and adoption of Microsoft technology solutions in public safety and justice that enable positive and productive outcomes of mission requirements. He is passionate about the safety and security of citizens in the global community, as well as working with customers around the world to achieve their mission. Prior to coming to Microsoft, Kirk was a supervisory special agent for the U.S. Secret Service, managing the San Francisco Electronics Crime Task Force and Asset Forfeiture Squad. In this capacity, he was responsible for overseeing global investigations involving network intrusions, data breaches, theft of intellectual property, and other digital and financial threats against the United States critical infrastructure. He was responsible for conducting community outreach initiatives on behalf of the U.S. Department of Homeland Security, of which the U.S. Secret Service reports under, to the private and public sector communities regarding current and emerging cybersecurity threats and responses to these threats. Kirk's career with the U.S. Secret Service spanned over 15 years, where he held positions as a criminal investigator in the field within headquarters and served on the Presidential Protective Detail during the Bush and Obama administrations. Well, Kirk, thanks for being on the Leadership Crucible podcast. Sure good to see you again.
Yeah, likewise. Thanks for having me.
You bet. So you've had really an interesting career, starting in law enforcement and working as a special agent for the Secret Service, including the Presidential Protection Detail, and now leading the worldwide public safety and justice arena for Microsoft. So quite an accomplished career. Could you tell us just a little bit about your journey?
Sure. It's been fun. It's not over yet, but we've had a good time. I grew up in a small town here in the state of Washington, so grew up playing team sports. I was always drawn to that, relying on other people. And, when I graduated high school and went on to college, my sophomore year, I took an introduction to law enforcement class. Instantly knew this is the right career path for me. Absolutely just love the energy, the competitive nature, but the idea of relying on your sisters and brothers, right, to come home end of watch. So ever since I took that sophomore class, I knew I was going to go into law enforcement. And when I graduated college, I had the honor to be a police officer for 3.5 years. I absolutely loved being on patrol. I wanted to get in the traffic unit. I was able to accomplish that, and I wanted to join the SWAT team, which was a blast. And so I did those things, but I always kind of had the eye to federal law enforcement as something just to try and live in other parts of the country, maybe do things overseas. And so, when I applied for Secret Service, ironically, I came home from one of my shifts as a police officer, and my wife was watching the Joan London special on Secret Service. And she's like, "This is you. This is," and so I turned in my application, and it's a long process, but 8 months later, I was hired as a special agent, and I got to start in the Seattle field office. I went to 6 months of training, both at the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center in Glencoe, Georgia, then Secret Service School up in Maryland. It was cool, right? My classmates were from military, from law enforcement. We just had a blast for the 6 months of training and just learning the mission. Secret Service is oftentimes just associated with the protections, but investigations is really half of what an agent does, and that piece really interested me as well. So got into the investigation side in Seattle, did the occasional foreign dignitary protection assignment, just had a blast for 4 years in the field. And then I got to go to Washington, D.C. and work in our criminal investigative division, I got pulled upstairs to work for one of our assistant directors, investigations. And there I was really exposed to one, leadership, leadership from my agency and leadership from other agency heads that would come visit Secret Service headquarters. I also learned the funding piece, programmatic overview, and how we
Mm-hmm.
wrote policies and budget requests to Homeland Security and to Congress to support the investigative mission, both from CID to investigative support and for forensic services. So that part was awesome. And at least for me, I joined the Secret Service because I did want to do the presidential detail. And so I had the opportunity to go to the Presidential Protective Division. I had President Bush's last 2.5 years in office and President Obama's first two. As an agent in those roles, you do a multitude of things. Working the rope line, the shift agent, that's just a small facet of what you do when you're on the detail. Probably my highlight was being assigned to the transportation section, where if you're not driving one of the armored vehicles, including the presidential limo, you're doing the motorcade advance. And the logistics, not just domestically, but overseas, wherever you take the sitting president, working with the White House Military Office, coordinating, transport
Mm-hmm.
vehicles via C-17s and C-5s to all corners of the world. That's a heavy logistical lift.
Yeah.
And be able to lean on everyone you work with, and those capabilities. Again, back to the team sports for me growing up, that is your team, right? To be successful,
Yeah.
And you're in a profession and an assignment that you can't have failure at all. And so that part was great, right? And so transportation, I went as an ops section for a bit, and I worked my way up to be a shift whip and do lead advances before I cycled off. Then I had a really cool opportunity to cycle back to the field. I came home to Seattle, and they put me in charge of the Electronic Crimes Task Force. And I'd written some of the policy stuff at headquarters at my time there, because we saw our criminals migrating away from, Secret Service was founded to combat counterfeit currency back in 1865.
Yeah.
When they started making computers and printers, the technical skills of a counterfeiter dropped dramatically. We started seeing young kids, everybody printing money, really poor quality, but you know what? It could pass here in the States. And so
Mm-hmm.
Secret Service saw that trend not only with counterfeit currency, but counterfeit credit cards, counterfeit driver's licenses, and a real need to evolve and skill up your agent population, but also your state and local law enforcement departments that you worked with and relied on. And so watching that whole progression was really interesting to me to kind of get the right tools in the hands of the investigators to make sure you can combat, at the time, the latest breaking forward edge kind of cyber-based financial fraud capabilities. So I did that in Seattle, which was awesome. And then I went down to San Francisco and I had the e-crimes task force down there, plus the asset forfeiture squad. So it was cool being the heart of Silicon Valley, right? The epicenter of technology. Just still working on those capabilities. And then asset forfeiture, one thing that was interesting to me at the time was digital currency. Bitcoin was becoming a thing. Now, hindsight, I wish I had bought some Bitcoin at the time. I didn't because I associated it with financial base and the dark web and crime. So, but we didn't know how to seize it. We had suspects and they had Bitcoin, and having to work with the U.S. Attorney's Office, like, well, how do you seize this thing? This isn't your traditional asset where you go grab it from a bank, you get a check or something like that. And so navigating that piece was kind of telling just to see how technology was evolving and the landscape was changing and shifting. And candidly, our suspects for cyber-based crimes almost predominantly overseas. And so it introduced a highly complex environment to how do I actually go, pursue somebody. One, it's a digital ghost, but when we do find them, they usually lived in a country that we didn't have extradition treaties with. So you had to kind of play a digital game of cat and mouse before you could intercept them in a favorable country where you could extradite. So just a slow process.
So you were really on the front end of cybersecurity then, weren't you?
Yeah, it was really interesting to see, one, how companies and governments, they really needed to fortify their systems, and because there's so many different legacy systems, it was almost an impossible task. And that certainly was exploited, continues to be exploited. Corporate America, public-private partnerships, which was what Secret Service e-crimes task forces were based on, that's foundational to the success going forward. It really needs to be an all-hands-on-deck perspective to work collectively. And certainly here at Microsoft, that's foundational for us.
So let's talk a little bit about what you do at Microsoft. I mean, you're kind of the coordinator, the head of all of public safety and for and for justice as well. So, I mean, tell us a little bit about what you do there.
Yeah, it was a really cool role. It was when I saw it, it was first tabled under the sales organization. I'm not a sales guy. I sold jail time, right? But really, it was a business strategy role. And what they brought me in to do was how does Microsoft's technology and reputationally Microsoft is Windows or the Office products people are familiar with,
Mm-hmm.
but what we're not thought of is in cloud or we're not thought of in business applications tools that can really help enable public safety agencies communicate amongst themselves, with peer organizations, with court systems, corrections. And so they brought me on to kind of harmonize that kind of vision, that strategy, and where does our technology play, and really our partner ecosystem. Companies that use Microsoft tools, they use our cloud environment, both infrastructure and platform capabilities, to make a better end product for public safety and justice agencies to use. What's that look like? And I do think for Microsoft, we're unique in the sense that from pre-incident response postures to open source intelligence and those capabilities to kind of help whether it's a natural disaster or unplanned event, you know, what can you do to help be better prepared for that? And then when the incident does occur, how can you give the right tools and capabilities to your first responders so they know exactly what they're getting themselves into before they arrive on scene? Whether it's a police officer going to a call for service for domestic violence, a fire crew going to a structure fire that
Mm-hmm.
might be on the third floor. There's data inputs, there's sensor inputs now that any agency, and really most developed countries, you can bring all that together and create a really clear common operating picture. And as an incident commander, being remote somewhere else can really help dictate the outcome and take that reactionary posture and better dictate the outcome of that event. And then the post incident, we all know how much technology is part of our daily lives. Almost every crime, we estimate 90% of the is the figure I've heard. 90% of all crime involves some form of technology.
Mm-hmm.
What that's created is, you got to be able to, seize the device, image it, process it, and visualize that evidence, not only to prosecutors, to defense counsel, but to jurors and the like. That's a lot of data, and it permeates around the world. And so we've kind of worked on that strategy of how does cloud, Azure's our cloud platform. How do the tools in Azure help investigators
Mm-hmm.
carve through that? Maybe it's a petabyte, maybe it's a terabyte, whatever the crime you're investigating. And we've proven that out over the years, and really position the platform there to do that piece. And then once that part of the investigation is done, what's that digital handshake look like to a judicial body, a court system? And how does that harmonize and work together? And then through the whole court process itself, we certainly saw with the pandemic, courts were ground to a halt. They
Mm-hmm.
couldn't do in-person hearings, and here's an entire government entity that's used to doing everything in person. Well, now you had to do things remotely. And people kind of stumbled through it. And going forward now, hybrid hearings, hybrid processes will be the wave of the future, and that future is here now. And then the last bit's correction. So not only just locking somebody up, but having some understanding of why they're in the system in the first place.
Yeah.
Do they have substance abuse issues, mental health challenges? Do they need skilling, training, something that when they get released, that maybe they have a job, they have a roof over their head, they have a support network, things that keep them out of the jail, right? So that combating recidivism and being good stewards there. And it all comes down to data. So how does that data live through that life
Yeah.
cycle? And so they hired me to kind of build out that vision, that strategy. And Microsoft's a great company, and it can actually support, from start to finish that whole process.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and they do excellent work. I think most of us use Microsoft, and so we appreciate the security of the system and what you're working on, because as you pointed out, there's just millions of data points out there that we can capture and analyze to make our situation, our lives better. And
Yep.
but you have to have that data to do that. And so, I mean, I think that's kind of the emerging trend of what we're going to see with smart buildings, smart cities, AI, BI, and all that, BA,
Yeah.
advanced analytics, and so. It's really kind of an exciting emerging field, and it will be very interesting to see where it goes in the next, 15,
Yep.
20 years.
And to that point, Randy, I think the cool thing for a public safety agency is that infrastructure exists, right?
Hmm.
A smart building, whoever built that building, they put that in by default this day and age. That's just a data input, a sensor input that you can leverage and harvest. It's not like you have to go build something yourself, right? And I think that's been the most exciting thing to see where technology's gotten is that, that IoT and edge capability.
Yeah, there'll be a time where, and it's not in the too distant future, where a 911 call will come in for a response into a building, and we'll know before we ever leave the fire station or leave the police station or your beat what you're going to be responding to, because you're going to
Yep.
have all the information of what the building or intel from phones and other technological applications in and around that building will tell us before we ever launch.
Yep. And
Yeah.
that's still, I came from public safety, right? So that's still the guiding principle: protect life and safety
Mm-hmm.
and property, right? And
Yep.
for me, it's also end of watch. Everyone needs to come home into their watch, and
Yep.
how do we make sure that happens?
Yeah, 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 yeah. Couldn't agree more. So, well, I know you've had a lot of situations in your life that have probably helped to shape who you've become as a leader and a manager and probably as an individual. Could you share one or two of those that really kind of set you on a different course, maybe?
Yeah, I think I mean, I'll root it in sports, but it evolves into law enforcement and what I touched on earlier, right? Like that team environment.
Mm-hmm.
And that's always shaped me, and especially with Secret Service. And I think anytime we did advanced work on the presidential detail, like it absolutely required that your communication skills were spot on and your organizational skills, and not only how you communicate with your immediate peers and your supervisors, but your stakeholders weren't part of your organization, and
Mm-hmm.
you relied on a lot of different layers of people to do their job and their capability. And so, for me, watching both senior agents, but certainly supervisors, understanding that complexity as you build out your concentric rings of security, like one, you have to understand it first. Then you have to be able to communicate what you understand and how you're actually going to deploy that. If you have gaps, if you wait to, we'd say game day, but the day of the event,
Yeah.
and you realize you have gaps, it's too late. Now you have a gap, a hole in your system, and that introduces risks. So that level of concentration and just role playing and understanding what you're doing in the moment and just hyper focused is really critical, but not focused to where you have blinders, right? You need that aperture to see things and understand things. And so, I think for me, just that communication piece, but really underscores, man, do the heavy lift fast, quick. You have a date and a time when that event's going to happen. Do as much as you can at the front end. Don't procrastinate, right?
Yeah.
Get that done at the forefront so you have some flexibility if things fall through, and they inevitably do, right? You're relying on other humans to do their job, which doesn't always happen, and certainly things get miscommunicated. So you want to have that. At least for me, I always want to have that extra bandwidth the day of the visit that we could address any challenges. And they always popped up
Oh
for
yeah.
sure.
Yeah. I mean, we worked with as a fire chief, worked with the Secret Service on several presidential visits in the cities that I was in, and number one was always impressed with just the level of professionalism and detail that the Secret Service folks always brought to the table, but also about the connectivity and the relationships that were built to make sure that everything or things were not missed. And you talked about the logistics of those events. It's quite incredible the amount of upfront work that goes in for maybe a 30-minute or an hour visit.
And you can appreciate it, but most people don't. They don't
Yeah,
understand what goes in to actually build that piece out.
yeah.
But the mission's so critical, and I think a piece of that leadership too is that's intense pressure. This as you from your leadership background is like keeping a level head and really controlling your emotions, and it
Hmm.
doesn't do any good for we probably all had leaders and coaches that they lose it, right? They go
Oh
nuts,
yeah,
and I don't operate well in that environment. And the last thing you want people is playing tight, right? You want them to play loose. So I think really controlling your emotions, understanding what is most critical quickly,
yeah.
and then working for resolution has always been the right path.
Yeah, I've always felt like from an incident command standpoint, you never want to let them see you sweat, right?
Yep.
You got to be cool and under, even if it's things aren't going as you as predicted. I mean, you can't let your team think that you're freaking out over it. So,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
so
100%.
yeah.
You know.
So, how has the pandemic changed and reshaped or evolved what you're seeing from existing leadership paradigms, maybe at Microsoft or with others that you're working with?
It's interesting because this remote work, and I'm just going to tell you, I'm old school. I like coming into the office. I like, seeing other people. And, I think the pandemic, for a lot of people, there's that level of isolation, especially for folks in public safety and justice. I'd say more even just government, right? Part of that fabric that draws you to that is that interaction with people, whether it's citizens and constituents coming in to talk with, or your coworkers and the camaraderie you have with that. And so we do know suicide rates, unfortunately, are statistically or historically high amongst first responders globally, and I think it's that lost bit of touch. So there's the operational piece of the pandemic and governments not being able to do the day to day and the scramble to come up with a hybrid or remote capability. I think that's put stress in the system. For Microsoft, I forget the statistic. Don't quote me on this, but I think it's 70 or 80% of our staff has been hired over the last 3 years. They've only known pandemic working for Microsoft. I can tell you my org that I'm in, I think that number is 70, maybe even 80%. So I still have people because we're global, we're a worldwide team. I have plenty of people. I've never seen them in person. They're just a screen. It's funny when you do see some of these people in person, you're like, they're either taller or shorter than you thought, or it wasn't what you expected. And so you just
Yeah,
realize how much you lose from that face-to-face in-person human interaction. So I do think, and we have a company, as a company, we're doing more and more studies, work health index, and those types of things, because going from meeting to meeting to meeting has a real strain on the psyche, and the human mind's not really built for that, to be concentrating that long, and you miss that social interaction, the
hmm,
nonverbal cues. So I think the pandemic, I think that's a negative aspect of it. I do think it, from a business perspective, it showed that hey, you can do some things remotely as needed, and maybe not by default, but certainly a viable option for that. For leadership, how do you make sure that your team, your staff are doing well? Depending what kind of active listener and emotional leadership you have, and ability to understand maybe your colleague or a direct report is going through some sort of stress. For me, I try and be in tune as much as possible, but that fatigue I talked about, if I'm feeling the fatigue, I might be missing something and causing strain with my direct reports. And so I think making sure they have you open line of trust, that dialogue, the connection, and just make sure that every call doesn't have to be a formal meeting or presentation. You can just talk,
yeah,
talk about the news, talk about nothing, right?
yeah.
How do we have that connection? So I think that's really important for me, what I try to do.
Yeah, I think that's really important, and I think many organizations are moving to more of a hybrid model, trying to get some people
Mm.
back in and letting them work a couple days or 3 days a week at home. But I think that interaction that you have when you're in the office helps you pick up on some of those personal issues, behavioral issues that can manifest themselves into work-related issues, but also if you're not there and you can't read those cues, you may miss as a supervisor, as their leader, and by the time it's recognized, you could have maybe engaged much sooner and really helped that employee. And
Yeah.
we missed that.
Yeah. And that's a fear, certainly, for first responders, right? Like, when someone becomes in crisis, one of your employees, it might be frontline news, right? And you've lost control of that
Yeah,
narrative. And is there an opportunity to intervene beforehand? And it is encouraging. Again, my role being worldwide is these are the conversations we're having with our global public safety and justice customers. Is that concern about their staff
yeah,
and the emotional well-being and the mental well-being of their staff. It's not taboo anymore. It's like they're really interested in how are my folks doing, right? And
Hmm.
there's indicators, right? If Kirk Arthur never calls in sick, and so I've been calling sick all the time. I never had citizen complaints, but now I'm getting complaints, more frequently. What's going on with me? And as a supervisor, to be aware of that and intervene and just have a conversation.
Yeah. No, I think it's extremely important, and I think that I've heard, well, the new normal of work is this, and I don't think we've found what the new normal is yet. I think we're still trying to adjust to getting back to work, but also recognizing that when we were all working from home, our productivity actually, and for most organizations, went up. And so
Yeah.
many companies are looking at that and go, well, why would we go back? And then others are saying we want everybody to come back, and the employees are going, well, we don't want to come back. And so there's that balance.
But that productivity going up, if you actually look at the hours that they're on their computer, they don't have boundaries, right? It's certainly not 8 to 4. It might be 7 to 10, right?
Yeah,
So they're going to burn themselves out. You might enjoy that near term productivity gain, but it's going to have a longer term impact.
that's a really excellent point because they're also not taking breaks through the day. So they're putting more hours in. They get focused on their work. They forget about the rest of their life. And, you're exactly right. That's just a bad recipe to burn somebody out and lose them as a great employee. So,
Yeah, it's going to be interesting. I think next 5 to 10 years, as we get the pandemic behind us, I think all the studies and the data and the insights that will come out of that will be interesting to see what the future of work really is.
yeah, yeah, I agree. So, what's your perspective on the current state of leadership today in our society?
Yeah, it's interesting. It's an interesting question. Because as a society, right? I blame our smartphones. Everyone's for that quick hit, whether it's through social media or just a quick news or sensationalism, and you know, it gets distracted. I think there's a lot of white noise out there, and for me, it's you still need to stand up and be a leader, whether you're a politician, a business executive, work for a public safety and justice organization, or just government in general. Like, own what you're doing, communicate effectively, have stakeholders, listen to everyone's perspective before you make a conclusion. That active listening, that things are so important and critical. But I just feel like I'll pick on our society here in the U.S., but attention span feels really, really short. And I do worry about the next. I got teenagers, right? That next generation of employee, they don't carry a very long attention span. Those devices are with them all the time.
Hmm.
It's 5 or 10 seconds, and they're thinking about doing something else. And what's that going to look like working, and sitting down and doing something? And in our professions, right? If you're responding to a call for service, boy, you better be focused because
Yeah.
you could get yourself in trouble, in harm's way. You could get your colleagues. Like, you need to be all hands on deck. So I worry about leadership and just a news headline or brief, moment of fame is dictating some behaviors and stuff. So, you know, I think the pendulum will swing back the other way. But I'm anxious for some more just traditional big leaders standing up and getting the recognition that they always deserve.
Yeah, I agree, and I think the 8 second time span that I've heard, or attention span, from a leader's perspective, when you're reacting that quickly, uh, bad things usually happen. I mean, in every
Yeah,
situation where I've reacted that quickly and not thought through, or sat on a decision for 24 hours, or researched it for 24 hours, it usually came back to bite me. Uh,
yeah,
uh, and so for I think our next generation of leaders, it's good to have that phone and that device to look things up. But even when you're looking things up, you have to take the source of what you're looking up and look that sort look whatever your information that you're looking for, maybe in 3 or 4 or 5 different places to make sure that your information is correct. Because today there's just so much out there that's not.
yeah. If you think about any of the unplanned or planned events, from natural disasters to active shooters here domestically, there's such a push from the media to get answers. and
Yeah.
it takes time, right?
Yeah.
And that rush to give them something like, hey, we're going to work this event, and we're going to speak in facts, and we're going to take emotions out of it, and just do your due diligence there. And I think it's that rush culture that we kind of have right now to get something out there, whether it's 100% accurate or not. And we need to slow down a little bit.
Yeah, no, agreed. And when you do that in a non-emergent situation in the office, it can really do some damage to your leadership ability going forward. So again, just kind of slow down and make sure your information is correct before you make that decision. So
Yep.
yep.
And be
So as
consistent.
leaders, I think what's that?
I was just gonna say, and be consistent. Lead from the front. What you message, whether it's a strategy or policy, follow it and hold people. Hold them accountable,
Yep.
and make sure you're doing it.
Yep. And I think you made another really good point that leaders need to own what they do. And in today's society, we often see the leadership blame going on, whether it's to the other political side or whatever the situation is. It's not my fault. It was somebody else's fault. When in fact, if you're the CEO of a company, you're ultimately responsible for that. If you're a fire chief or a police chief, you're ultimately responsible for everything that goes on in that organization. So if something's not right, own up to it and say you'll correct it, or you'll find out the answer. And so often we're not seeing that today.
Yep.
So leaders are always growing and changing as you kind of go through your development process. And how important have you found that to be to retain your skill set or improve on your skill sets to being a good leader?
Yeah, I think you always have to remain curious, right? And open-minded. At Microsoft, we talk about the growth mindset, and it comes from Satya, our CEO, and he lives it every day. And it's why Microsoft's been so successful under the 8 years that he's been at the helm. It's kind of permeated down through the entire company. And think about we're 160,000 people, and him driving that mantle and what we've talked about. He lives it every day. The leadership principles, but always being curious. And one quote he used to say, and I like it a lot, is each of us isn't as strong as all of us, right? And so making sure you're getting perspectives from everybody, not just your immediate inner circle or people that you're comfortable with, but get the perspectives of other people from different backgrounds and different walks of life, because their perspectives matter. And whether it's in government or if it's in the private sector, having as much insights and emotional intelligence from other things, I think is really important just to drive what you're
Mm-hmm.
doing. Because, like I said at the start, I grew up in a small town, right? I have a certain rural perspective, far different than anyone that grew up in an urban environment or suburban. So bringing all those different perspectives, I think, to really kind of see something from all different angles is really powerful. There's no shortage of books to read or podcasts to listen to or webinars to attend. So finding things that are always resonate with you. Certainly, people have done successful things that maybe puts you out of your comfort zone, but is effective. That's a growth mindset. So what can you do? Be comfortable being uncomfortable, and always kind of leaning forward. And I always like to use a SWOT term of flow like water. Where am I going to go on this journey in life, and how do I keep growing and evolving?
Yep. Yep. Good point. I mean, if you get locked in on where you think you're going to be, right? You find out that that's very, very soon that's not to be the case. I mean, you probably, when you started your law enforcement career, didn't think at that point in time you were going to end up at the Secret Service or at Microsoft. And if you would have been really myopic about where you were going to go, you probably would still be in law enforcement, right?
Yeah, I mean, Kirk Arthur 27 years ago. I'm just a young cop just out doing it, right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah. You got to kind of take it where it takes you. So what do you see for the next generation of leaders? What are some of the challenges that you think they're going to face?
So I think communication is going to be the biggest challenge. I think, especially that generation, we kind of touched on this, right? Like that next generation is going to be entering the workforce. they're digital natives. And I'll say for government, but certainly for public safety and justice entities, if you're trying to attract and retain talent that are digital natives, but you have antiquated paper-based processes, that's going to be difficult. Think like I think someone told me court stenographers. That's like a dying profession, right? And there's modern capabilities using AI that can do as good, if not better, sometimes. But you still need people to do things. So how do you attract that next generation? How do you communicate with them? How I communicate with my teenagers. From when I was a teenager, I knew how I responded, and it's far different than how they respond. So really understanding generationally what things are. And I used to kind of not pay too much attention, certainly when I was younger, on the generation Ys and Zs and whatever that might be. But there's a foundation there, and in some generations they question everything, right? And we've come from a world you don't question the chain of command. Someone may not be questioning out of malice; they just simply that's just how they are. And so in a paramilitary organization, rather than barking or biting their head off, maybe there's a different communication pattern or something to stabilize that piece, so they understand that, hey, you've got to follow leadership, because if you don't, it can result in an injury, loss of life for yourself or somebody else. Like, there's a reason, there's a structure in place. But I think you have to spend time and articulate that. So I just think communications will be the biggest challenge. And again, this generation, they spend so much time just with a phone in their face, right? And even when they're talking, like, they could be sitting next to each other. I remember I was at dinner last year with my wife, and the table next door over, this young couple, was on a date. They're texting back and forth. I was like, "Can you guys just talk?" That's how they communicate. It was weird, right?
Yeah,
And
yeah,
so,
yeah, I know.
but that's the new generation. So understanding that piece.
Yeah, I was talking with a young emerging leader a couple of weeks ago, and he says one of the things that he even had to learn as he stepped into his new role is, he says, when they question you, they're not questioning your authority. They're really questioning why, because they want
Yep.
to know the why. And so he said, I had to kind of step back and say, well, they're not questioning me as the leader. They're questioning why I'm doing what I'm doing as the leader, not that I have the authority to do it. So interesting perspective. And just knowing that going in with this new generation is probably very important for most leaders, whatever generation you come from.
Yep. And because isn't the answer they're looking for. So
No.
you're going to need to.
Yeah, because I'm in charge doesn't work.
Yeah.
That's very, very true. So, Kirk, what takeaways would you leave for our leaders today, and maybe those that are looking to step into leadership roles in the future?
Yeah, I think building on the be curious and that growth mindset, but also be inspirational for that next generation, and look to promote and mentor people that don't necessarily have your common background, or some of you would be drawn to. Look beyond your comfort zone for other people that you may want to raise, and provide insights to, that mentorship and investing in. So look for that talent that may not be as obvious at first blush, but when you dig a little deeper, and you can understand, like, wait a minute, we're going to be better with that person maturing and going through the hierarchy organizational construct there. So I think those types of things are going to really resonate, both in the private sector and the public sector.
Yeah, I totally agree. It's going to be an interesting time. We're going to have 5 generations that will be in the workforce at one time, and as you spoke to earlier, that I think it's becoming more important that leaders and managers understand those generational differences, because it's going to take some finesse to bring them all together and keep them focused on what the mission is, and no matter what your line of business is, and so yeah, I think it's a really important important thing to keep in mind.
Yep. Yeah. And there's no shortage of, I mean, there's plenty of data out there to tell you, kind of things that, how each generation thinks and processes information, and just be an active learner.
Yeah, and I think yeah, I think there's yeah, plethora of information about also what they value and what they really gravitate towards too. And I think from a leader's perspective, it's important to understand that because that's how they will relate. That's how they will choose your company or choose where they work. It's going to be value alignment. And so we should be thinking now about how we developed our organizational DNA to actually attract the top tier talent that we need to attract. And a lot of companies, a lot of organizations, they're not thinking that way.
No, and I mean certainly domestically, but globally, there's a staffing shortage for first responders. So, in a competitive landscape, how, as a police chief or fire chief, how can I be more enticing to at least fill my roster ahead of somebody else? And so there's importance for that.
Yeah, and I think that's permeating throughout many professions right now.
Yep, agreed.
Yeah. So, well, Kirk, thank you so much for being on the Leadership Crucible podcast. It's great to connect with you again, and wish you the best in the future. And we'll have you back on a future date.
Yeah, appreciate you letting me attend. So appreciate the time. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to the Leadership Crucible podcast. If you have a story of adversity you'd like to share, we'd love to hear it. Visit us at theleadershipcruciblepodcast.com and join us next time as we continue to explore how to live lives of success and significance.